simultaneous space is acoustic because what you hear from all directions at once, which creates a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose margin is nowhere. The peculiar character of acoustic space is simultaneously coming from all directions, creating this strange space which is spherical and musical, all directions at once, equals right hemisphere. Have you ever asked yourself why drugs have suddenly become popular when they weren't, say, 30 years ago?
I think it's because there's no future.
No. Inner tripping is naturally electric. All electricity is inner tripping. The electric age is inner trip, period.
Say this blanket represents all the matter and energy in the universe, okay? You, me, everything. Nothing has been left out, all right? All the particles, everything.
What's outside this blanket?
More blankets, that's the point.
Blanket's everything.
Exactly. This is everything, okay? Let's just say that this is me, right? And I'm, 60-odd years old, I'm wearing a gray suit, blah, blah, blah. And let's say over here, this is you, and you're, I don't know, you're 21, you've got dark hair, etc. And over here, this is Vivian, my wife and colleague. And then over here, this is the Eiffel Tower, right? It's Paris. And this is a war, and this is a museum, and this is a disease, and this is an orgasm, and this is a hammer.
No, they will take away every vestige of private being that you possess and private image. That's already happening at very high speed.
So, as Michael said, are you basing your point of view towards any? I guess you're not basing it towards a goal, but can you relate it to the ending of the society, or the changing of society, or is there any direction?
I'm pretty sure that when people see the pattern of things around them, then the thing is already cured.
In his 1953 essay, The Question Concerning Technology, Heidegger writes and produces a quite interesting theory in which he says that technology enframes beings as standing reserve. Now, let's explain that for just a moment. What he means is this. By standing reserve, he simply means, and the German term here is just Bestand. By standing reserve, he means technology treats being as stuff. A good metaphor for standing reserve would be inventory. The inventory in a warehouse. That is, all the materials waiting to be used. At the same time, he says, technology enframes beings that way, meaning the use of modern technological devices, along with the scientific theories that understand them, justify them, and are used in operating modern technologies. Technology, in this broad sense, imposes a framework or a structure through which we understand the world. In a sense, this treats all being as resource or inventory, a status which covers over the being that is disclosed. In other words, what he's saying is, we in the modern world no longer experience being as it disclosed itself to earlier epochs of human beings. At all times in history, being has disclosed itself and also concealed itself. In other words, we understand some things and not others. We know some things and we don't. And Heidegger is not claiming that somehow in the past all was disclosed. There's no such thing. But he is saying that in our age, there is this new threat to our understanding of being. Science and technology are themselves the completion of the task of metaphysics that began with Plato, which treated being through presence, or the present, one mode of time, and projects onto this presence the idea, that is the concept, a creation of the philosophical imagination. In other words, being is then shrunk to what is present, and the present is made dependent on the mind's ideas. But, and this is characteristic of the late Heidegger, overcoming technology doesn't mean rejecting or destroying it. He's a bit more sophisticated than that. It means returning to the concealed truth that technology has covered over. That technology was itself a creative act. Attending to the creative act of the invention of technology can be a way to understand what lies beneath the technology. You see, always the aim for Heidegger in this later period is to look back historically again to the fork in the road. At some point in the fork in the road, human beings create something novel. That creation can teach us something because being has disclosed something to us whenever we create something new. But quickly, we get so concerned with the created thing, with the new technology, that we forget the being that lies under it. So the technology fascinates us and lets our attention pass over without noticing its origin, its having been granted by being. What we need is not the absence of technology. In other words, we don't have to go back to the Stone Age, but sensitivity to the truth, what he thinks of as the originary aletheia, what's originally being disclosed by the creation and use of the technology. Now, being itself must grant and frame it. Let me stop here for just a second and say, Heidegger is, again, he's being sophisticated here. Doesn't mean he's being right, but he's being sophisticated because he's doing something every radical philosopher must do, which is, if things are so different than what everybody else thinks they are, well, why is everybody else so wrong? What has led us all to be so wrong? That has to be explained too. Now, Heidegger has to say, our technological enframing of the world has itself to have been granted by being, because for him everything is granted by being. So being, which grants enframing, thereby turns itself into the oblivion of itself. In other words, being has granted us marvelous new means by which we are able to ignore being, okay? By which being is more and more obscured. It's our task to turn that moment into unconcealment. In other words, in the very heart of our greatest mistakes, that's the place to look, to try to understand what we have forgotten and what's been concealed from us. What is needed then to do this is not philosophy, but what he calls thinking. In thinking technology, we must return to the ancient Greek notion of techne, which in Greek techne simply meant the practical arts. That is, both sculpture is techne, but so is shoemaking techne. And you see, in the concept of techne precedes the distinction between, in effect, fine art and sort of utilitarian creation. He wants to return to that fundamental idea. That's the purpose of his essay on technology, to get us back to that point. In a later essay, 1966 essay called The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking, Heidegger makes the remarkable claim that cybernetics, or information technology, he would say today, the telecommunications revolution, is the final fulfillment of philosophy. Why? Because it is an example of the will to power, understanding reality as pure information. Information is, after all, something immediately accessible to the mind. To try to understand being as if it were information is like trying to say, in Plato's sense, that the true reality is an idea. All of this is wrong, of course, from Heidegger's point of view. At any rate, Heidegger claims that philosophy has now been completed by science and technology. He's literally claiming contemporary science and technology have finished doing the thing that Plato started doing 2,400 years ago, this thing called philosophy. Information technology completes the Western search for power over being, substitutes the idea or concept for being itself, and reifies being as an entity. What Heidegger wishes for instead is a kind of thinking that will remain when such philosophy ends, a thinking that thinks, as in his language he would put it, the opening of aletheia, the unconcealment, which is the source of both being and thinking. The task is to think that. That is, the task is to try to think that source of unconcealment that being accomplishes, which is the source of everything we know. This thinking is, he uses another Greek term, ecstatic. The Greek term, the term ecstasy, which we get from the Greek, originally comes from the roots ek and stasis, which simply means being outside the self. So the whole method of thinking, by imposing concepts of the self on being, that's what the history of philosophy tried to do, is now being rejected here in favor of something more like ontological poetry. In effect, a way of writing that's no longer propositional. It doesn't look like normal inquiry in logical form of logical propositions, but is an attempt to write and think the moment of revelation of being by itself.